This series is Hidden Truths, Stories of Race and Place. And as some of you know who've been along for the ride in previous iterations, this is a series that was designed and organized in response to student voices who have very compellingly made the case at Roger Williams that we needed to provide more opportunities for learning about questions of diversity and equity and inclusion, especially as they are related to our own community and our own region. And one of the things that this series has really allowed us to celebrate and highlight is the incredible wealth of expertise that we have within our own community, both members of our university faculty and also various other kinds of partners and folks that we have relationship in the community. So tonight is no different in that our speaker is a member of our Gabelli School of Business faculty, who it so happens was hired the same year I was. And so we're some kind of faculty siblings here at Roger Williams University. Rupayan Gupta is professor of economics at the Mario J. Gabelli School of Business. After completing his PhD in economics from the Iowa State University in 2005, and having been previously an undergraduate student at St. Xavier's College in Calcutta, and having done a master's degree at the Delhi School of Economics. His areas of expertise are public economics, political economy, and the economics of conflict. His research includes designing international institutions for global security, analysis of conflict in disputed regions, corruption in the media, and the study of global remittance patterns. His research has been published in the Canadian Journal of Economics, the Public Choice Journal, the Journal of Defense and Peace Economics, and the Economics of Peace and Security Journal, among others. And at RWU, he teaches courses in microeconomics, game theory, public finance, economics of global security, and the economic history of pre-colonial trade in the Indian Ocean, which is the inspiration for the talk he's going to share with us tonight. We hope that you'll be jotting your questions and comments that you might have into the chat function, where I will be scanning throughout the talk and getting ready for the Q&A period that'll come right at the end of the hour, where I will do my best to understand and bring forward into the conversation the questions and thoughts that are on your minds. So thanks so much for letting us know how things are going in the chat. And Rupayan, thanks so much for being our speaker tonight.
Thank you, Jason, for your very kind introduction. And thank you, Laura, for inviting me to give this talk. And thank you to everyone else for being here to listen to me this evening. So I'm just going to share my screen. So my talk today is going to be about Europeans in India. It's a story of race and empire. And, one of the things that has been that as a student of economics, I had come across in my studies is that, well, it was a question of economics. It was a question of economic markets, access to economic markets, and getting of raw materials from the less industrialized nations, and then selling products to the less industrialized nations. But this, as you will see, what I argue today is that it's not only just a story of economics, but it is a story of race and racism as well. So first, let me define racism, pretty much the dictionary definition. So, I guess you're all familiar with the definition, okay, which I have up here. I won't belabor that. But one interesting thing is that Merriam-Webster is actually considering an updated definition recognizing systemic racism, and they have agreed to it. We don't know yet what the new definition will look like, as far as I know. I haven't seen the new definition yet, but they've agreed to it. Okay, so with this definition in mind, I am going to move along and think a little bit about how racism manifests itself. It can manifest itself through microaggressions, denigration, verbal, mental, physical. In the context of colonialism and empire, denigration, we will see there is a lot of denigration that happens. We also see the devaluation of human life and well-being. There is systemic discrimination also. And as we will see, there's basically a lot of criminal neglect going on. Of course, there is manifest violence, and this manifest violence is beyond the existing intra-group norms of the age. So within a group, you wouldn't see this kind of violence taking place. But as far as the outside group is concerned, you will see manifestations of violence far beyond the norms of the age. Finally, violence through policy, as we will see in a little bit. And just noting that violence may be against people, it also may be against a culture or civilization. So let's think about colonization in India a little bit. So who were the major colonial powers in India? The Portuguese, the British, the French, the Dutch. Of these, the British and the Portuguese were able to maintain a significant colonial presence over multiple centuries. The Portuguese state of India lasted for a long while. Actually, it lasted for much longer than British rule in India, from 1505 to 1961. So actually, the Portuguese dominions in India were taken over by the Indian state later than the independence from the British. And the British company rule and the subsequent British Raj lasted from 1757 to 1947. So let me share basically what these dominions look like, the Portuguese as well as the British dominions, just to give you an idea of place. So this is a map of Portuguese holdings in India. And so what you see is that in this map that, they had various holdings across the time period. The main focus is on Goa, which they held from 1509 all the way up to 1961. As far as the British holdings in India are concerned, again, let me show you a map. This is kind of a map of the British holdings at the beginning of the 20th century, basically. So everything that you see in red, pinkish red, are the British holdings in the Indian subcontinent. So as you can see, the holdings, stretch beyond present-day India, all the way in the east up to Burma, and then again on the west all the way up to Balochistan, which is part of modern-day Pakistan. What you see in yellow are what were known as the princely states, which were states which were under control by Indian rulers who, however, swore allegiance to the British Crown. So basically, this is the the land areas that we are talking about. So the way I'm going to talk about it is that first, I'm going to talk a little bit about the economics of it. So if we look at the economics of it, we have the theory of the Great Drain, the economic consequences of colonization. Basically, in 1700, India's share of the world economy was 27%. By 1947, it had dropped to just over 3%. India's share of global trade in textiles was about 25% in the early 18th century. This declined, a great deal. The value of yarn output fell from about 419 million pounds in 1850 to about 240 million pounds in 1900. Kind of almost halved. So, and the British extracted from India about 18 million pounds each year from 1765 to 1815. Okay, and we are talking about a time when obviously money was more valuable. So when we are talking about 18 million pounds, in terms of today's currency, it would be much more. There is a sort of a belief that India was an agrarian economy throughout, but that's not true. Manufacturing exports fell during the British times from a 27% share of the world total to about 2% under British rule. Let me just read an excerpt from a treatise by the American Unitarian minister, G.T. Sunderland. Nearly every kind of manufacture or product known to the civilized world, nearly every kind of creation of man's brain and hand existing anywhere and prized either for its utility or beauty had long been produced in India. India was a far greater industrial and manufacturing nation than any in Europe or any other in Asia. Her textile goods, the fine products of her looms in cotton, wool, linen, and silk were famous over the civilized world. So were her exquisite jewelry and her precious stones cut in every lovely form. So were her pottery, porcelains, ceramics of every kind, quality, color, and beautiful shape. So were her fine works in metal, iron, steel, silver, and gold. She had great architecture, equal in beauty to any in the world. She had great engineering works. She had great merchants, great businessmen, great bankers, and financiers. Not only was she the greatest shipbuilding nation, but she had great commerce and trade by land and sea, which extended to all known civilized countries. Such was the India which the British found when they came. So let me move on from the economics of it to the racist underpinnings of colonialism. And what we see here is that the economic subjugation was established and propagated by acts that conform very closely to the manifestations of racism that we just saw earlier. So what I'm going to do is that look at 5 episodes of racial violence over a period of 500 years of colonial rule. Okay, so we will first look at the Goa Inquisition and the tale of the textile weavers of Bengal. Then Macaulay's Minute. This is the implementation of a British educational policy in India. And finally, moving closer to our times, which we would think would be more civilized in nature, the Julian Walabad massacre, and finally, just before independence, the Bengal famine of 1943. So let's look at the Goa Inquisition. So prior to the arrival of the Portuguese, this is in the early 1500s, the littoral of the Indian Ocean was a place where there was strategic harmony between different religions, cultures, races. Obviously, there was sporadic territorial warfare, but there was some broad norms that were observed. And this was between the Muslims, the Hindus, Jews. An account of that is readily found in a book called The Trade and Civilization of the Indian Ocean, from Islam to 1750 by the historian K.N. Chaudhry. If anyone is interested, I will be glad to lend a copy. So what happened was that during Vasco da Gama, and this is where it closely, the modus operandi mirrors closely to the modus operandi of the conquistadors in the New World. So during Vasco da Gama's second voyage to India in 1502, so the highlight of that is a massacre of a ship of around 400 Muslim pilgrims to Mecca on the Hajj. So the Hajj was something that was respected. It was respected by Hindus, it was respected by Jews. So ships carrying Hajj pilgrims were rarely molested. But what happened was that 400 pilgrims to Mecca, including women and children, were massacred, and this was to avenge the looting of a Portuguese factory by Arab merchants during a previous conflict, which killed about 70 Portuguese expeditionaries. Of course, the commander of that expedition, Pedro Cabral, had killed many Arabs in retaliation, but that didn't, stop Da Gama from behaving in this fashion. He also captured several vessels and cut off the crew's hands, ears, noses, and proceeded to bombard the city of Calicut. There is a biography of Vasco da Gama by the once Delhi School of Economics, now UCLA economic historian Sanjay Subramaniam, which accounts for these incidents, But today I'm going to mainly talk about the Goa Inquisition. So I think most people here have heard about the Spanish Inquisition. I'm going to talk about the Goa Inquisition, which was established in 1561. And this was to deter the new Christians who were Hindu converts who were accused of crypto-Hinduism, so they still followed some of the beliefs that they held to previously, and observations they held to previously, and old Christians who were the Jewish converts who were accused of Judaism. So basically, the records of the Inquisition, the Goa Inquisition, were destroyed upon its conclusion. But there are some estimates that can be found in a book by Antonio Jose Saraiva, who was a professor of literature at Lisbon University. He has a book called The Marano Factory, Portuguese Inquisition and its New Christians, 1536 to 1765. There is an appendix on the Goa Inquisition. Because the records were destroyed, there is no definite record of what went on, but from what can be ascertained, there were upward of 14,000 persons who were tried by the tribunals of the Inquisition in Goa. There were more than 50 who were executed, more than 60 were burned in effigy as they already died, many of them in jail. Many others suffered brutal treatment and punishment. So carrying it forward, practice of the Hindu faith was forbidden And in 1620, there was an order forbidding performance of Hindu marriage rituals, and Hindu and Buddhist temples were demolished. And in 1684, the use of the local Konkani language was forbidden. So, in the history of the Inquisition, there is a very poignant account that is written in French. I'm going to read a little bit of translation from that by a certain Gabriel Delon, who was actually a French Catholic. This was written in 1688, and Delon was actually detained by the Goa Inquisition because he criticized, what was going on in Goa. So, so I read from the history of the Inquisition as it was exercised in Goa by Gabriel Delon. So so this is an account of one of the punishments. So he says, this ceremony being ended and the inquisitor returned to his place, they brought out one after the other those unhappy victims who were to be sacrificed by the Holy Inquisition. There were a man, a woman, and the representation of 4 dead men with little chests wherein their bones were enclosed. The man and woman were Indian blacks and Christians accused of magic and condemned as relapsed. Of the 4 statues, 2 represent also 2 men held convicted of magic, and the 2 others 2 men who had been new Christians and were accused of have Judaized, of which one had died in prison, the other in his own house. The several processes of these unfortunate persons were read, which were all ended with these words, that the Inquisition could not shew any mercy to them because of their relapse and their impenitence, and that finding themselves indispensably obliged to punish them according to the rigor of the laws, they delivered them to the secular arm and justice, whom they earnestly desired to use clemency and mercy towards these miserable wretches, and that if they would impose upon them punishment of death, it might at least be without effusion of blood. See the great kindness of the Inquisition to intercede thus for guilty persons, the extreme condescendence of the magistrates to choose rather than complaisance to the Inquisition, to content himself to burn this criminal to the very marrow of their bones than to use the power which he hath of shedding their blood. As soon as the condemned persons are arrived at the place where the secular judges are assembled, they ask them in what religion they will die, without informing themselves in the least of their process, in which they suppose to have been perfectly well managed, and the persons most justly condemned, since no doubt is to be made of the infallibility of the Inquisition. As soon as they have answered to this one question, the executioner seizes them and tied them to posts upon the pile, where they are first strangled if they die Christians and burned alive if they persist in Judaism or heresy, which happens so seldom that scarce one example is to be seen in the 4 acts of faith, although there are very few in which are not burned a good number of persons. So the question now is that, can this be categorized as racial persecution, or should this be categorized as religious persecution alone? So the way I'm going to answer this question is by comparing the Goa Inquisition with the Spanish Inquisition. So there's an argument about the racist character of the Spanish Inquisition based on the fact that the Inquisition was closely connected in Spain, very closely connected with the persecution of Jews and Muslims who had converted to Christianity, but were thought of relapsed, and also with the expulsion of Muslims and Jews from Spain at that time. So obviously, if we think that there is a racist character because of the fact that the people who were targeted, who were targets of this policy, if I may put it that way, as an economist, I kind of to think of things as policy. If there's a policy that's disproportionately affecting people of a certain race or a certain religion more than others, then I would argue that it is racial in nature. In fact, by the modern definition of racism, I would think that we can think that this persecution is not just religious persecution, but also racial persecution. Let me move on. This is circa 1770, and this is about British rule and British rule in Bengal. So the British came to power in Bengal, so to say, after the Battle of Plassey, where they defeated the local Nawab. From here on, I will mainly talk about incidents, in British India, simply because they were the most prevalent colonial power in India over time. So here, what you see is that for hundreds of years, the weavers of Bengal produced very fine clothing, textiles, fine muslins. So around 1750s, the value of textile exports from Bengal was annually about 2 million British pounds, and silk exports around 8,000 British pounds annually till 1753. What we see is that when the British were just traders, their demand actually raised Bengal's textile and silk production by 33% during 1700s. When they became rulers, systematic economic policy destroyed this industry. But we see that there is also terrible personal violence against the weavers. So I'm going to read an excerpt from William Bolt's 1772 book, Considerations on India Affairs. William Bolt was actually a Dutch-born British merchant who was active in India. He began his career as an employee of the East India Company and then became an independent merchant. And so this is from his book. In the time of the Mughal government, and even in that of the Nawab Alivardi Khan, the weavers manufactured their goods freely and without oppression. And though there is no such thing at present, it was then a common practice for reputable families of the Tanti or the weaver caste to employ their own capitals in manufacturing goods, which they sold freely on their own accounts. Therefore, every kind of oppression to manufacturers of all denominations throughout the whole country daily increased. So he's speaking about after the British rule started, insomuch that the weavers, for daring to sell their goods, and dalals and pikers, for having contributed to or connived at such sales, have by the company's agents been frequently seized and imprisoned, confined in irons, fined considerable sums of money, flogged and deprived in the most ignominious manner of what they esteem most valuable, their carts. Weavers also, upon their inability to perform such agreements as have been forced from them by the company's agents, universally known in Bengal by the name of machalkas, have had their goods seized and sold on the spot to make good the deficiency. And the winders of raw silk, called nagads, have been treated also with such injustice that instances have been known of their cutting of their thumb to prevent their being forced to wind silk. So so they are being treated in such a way that they're actually causing self-harm to escape the clutches of the agents of the company. So again, the question is that is this again just economic policy, or is this racist in nature? Okay, so what I'm going to do is that I'm going to compare this with the treatment of workers in the factory system in the UK or the US during that era. I mean, that was deplorable, as we know. Just Sundays off, children being forced to work. On very long work days, things like that, poor work conditions and stuff like that. But deplorable as it was, this is simply utter devaluation of human well-being and violence that is quite consistent, I think, with the treatment of the other, right? That helps us think about the racist tinge of this economic activity. I move on to Macaulay's Minute. This was 1835. So I'm progressing down the ages, and this is basically Thomas Babington Macaulay, British historian, Whig politician, served as Secretary of War and the Paymaster General. So he was instrumental in the introduction of English and Western education in India. So he publishes in 1835 a minute on education, where he writes, a single shelf of a good European library was worth the whole native literature of India and Arabia. So what Macaulay was advocating, and this is a quote from the minute, that the British should try to form a class who may be interpreters between us, he means the British, and the millions whom we govern, a class of persons Indian in blood and color, but English in taste, opinions, morals, and intellect. Okay, so this is, this is how, a few thousand people control a million people by creating this intermediate class. And so what Macaulayism did was that systematically wiped out traditional Indian education, sciences, vocation systems, and so basically, when I think about this, I think that the philosophy of Macaulayism bears a very close resemblance to the philosophy that we see in Kipling's poem, The White Man's Burden, which he wrote in 1899, The White Man's Burden in the United States and the Philippine Islands, advocating, as most of you would know, US intervention in the Philippines. And this, and before that, the 19th century philosophy of manifest destiny that was seen in the United States. Of course, a fitting reply to the Kipling's poem was provided by none other than Mark Twain in his satire, to the person sitting in darkness, where he talked about the, things surrounding the Boxer Rebellion and other things in China. So and one can see in Macaulay's philosophy a philosophy that is very close to that lay behind the founding of Native American boarding schools in the United States. And definitely, I think it would conform to our definition of cultural violence. Moving on again. This is the Julian Walabad massacre of 1919. Okay, this is when Woodrow Wilson is president of the United States. The Federal Reserve had already been founded, so we would like to think of it as a more civilized age. Obviously, thinking back, to what has been revealed about Woodrow Wilson now, obviously there's more to say about that, but let me come back here. So in 1990, what happens is that the Rowlatt Act was promulgated by the British. All of India protested. So what basically Rowlatt Act was, detention without trial and without a jury trial, and indefinite imprisonment without a trial process. protests happen in Punjab, which was the northwestern province of India. So what happens on April 13, 1919, is that there's a gathering of 10 to 15,000 in an enclosed square called the Walabad. And this was actually not a political protest. This was to celebrate a spring festival. And then troops led by Brigadier General Reginald Dyer opened fire on the crowd. Indian estimates converge to around 1,499 killed and 1,137 injured. Dyer, of course, is unrepentant. The official Hunter Commission finds him in grave error. There are no real consequences. After an outcry, he's censured by the House of Commons, but exonerated by the House of Lords. Okay? Actually, the account of this is so ingrained in the Indian psyche that you would actually need a writer, to speak about this. So what I'm going to do is that I'm going to read an excerpt from the book Inglorious Empire by Shashi Tharoor, who many of you might know as the Undersecretary General to the United Nations formerly. He's now a politician and a writer in India. Okay, so he says, in March and April 1919, Indians rallied across Punjab to protest the Robert Acts. They shut down normal commerce in many cities, including Amritsar, through hartals, which are strikes on 30th March and 6th April. Through empty streets and shuttered shops, the dissatisfaction of the people at the British betrayal. This was a form of Gandhian non-violent non-cooperation. No violence or disorder was reported during the strikes. But on 9th April, with no provocation, the British government in Punjab arrested two nationalist leaders, Dr. Saifuddin Kichlu and Dr. Satyapal, who had addressed the protest meetings. As news of this arrest spread, the people of Amritsar came out onto the streets and sought to push their way to police headquarters to protest the arrest. The police barred the way, some stones were thrown by agitated civilians. The police retaliated by opening fire, killing 10 demonstrators. This inflamed the crowd, which reacted to the police killing by venting the fury on any visible symbol of the British Empire. The riot that ensued, 5 Englishmen were killed and a woman missionary assaulted. However, she was rescued and carried to safety by Indians. The British promptly sent troops to Amritsar to restore order. By 11th April, 600 soldiers arrived, followed the next day by the commander, Brigadier General Reginald Dyer. By then, the city was calm, and whatever demonstrations and protest meetings were occurring were entirely peaceable. Meanwhile, unaware, so I skip ahead, meanwhile, unaware of a proclamation by Dyer, outlawing protests, some 10 to 15,000 people from outlying districts gathered in the city the same day to celebrate the major religious spring festival of Vaisakhi. They had assembled in an enclosed wall garden, Walabad. When Dyer learned of this meeting, he did not seek to find out what it was about, whether attendees were there in open defiance or merely ignorance of his orders. He promptly took a detachment of soldiers in armored cars equipped with machine guns and parked his vehicles in front of the gate. Without ordering the crowd to disperse and without issuing a warning, even though it was apparent it was a peaceful assembly of unarmed civilians, Dyer ordered his troops to open fire from some 150 yards away. The crowd of thousands of unarmed, non-violent men, women, children gathered peacefully in confined space started screaming and pressing in panic against the closed gate. But Dyer ordered his men to keep firing till all ammunition was exhausted. When the troop had finished firing, they had used 1,650 rounds, killed at least 379 people that the British prepared to admit to. The unofficial Indian numbers are higher. Most converge at a figure of 1,499 killed. The history knows this event as the Jallianwala Bagh Massacre. But there was nothing of this Jallianwala. Dyer soldiers were lined up calmly, almost routinely. They were neither threatened nor attacked by the crowd. It was just another day's work, but one unlike any other. They loaded and fired their rifles boldly, clinically, without haste or passion or sweat or anger. emptying their magazines into the shrieking, wailing, and then stampeding crowd with trained precision. As people sought to flee the horror towards the single exit, they were trapped in a murderous fusillade. 1,650 bullets were fired that day into the unarmed throng. When the job was finished, just 10 minutes later, hundreds of people lay dead and several thousands more lay injured. Okay, so Tharoor says, let me turn to the American Will Durant to provide gruesome details of the further actions of Dyer. General Dyer issued an order that Hindus using the streets in which the woman missionary had been beaten should crawl on their bellies. If they tried to rise on all fours, they were struck by the butts of soldiers' guns. He arrested 500 professors and students and compelled all students to present themselves daily for roll calls, though this required that many of them should walk 16 miles a day. He had hundreds of citizens and some schoolboys, quite innocent of any crime, flogged in the public square. He built an open cage, unprotected from the sun, for the confinement of arrested persons. The other prisoners he bound together with ropes and kept in open trucks for 15 hours. He had lime poured upon the bodies of sadhus, these are mendicants, and exposed them to sun's rays. He cut off the electric and water supplies from Indian houses and ordered all electric fans to be surrendered. No doubt, some will say that Brigadier General Dyer was an aberration, one of those military sadists that every army throws up from time to time. The excuse will not wash. Not only was Dyer given a free hand to do as he pleased, but news of his barbarism was suppressed for 6 months. And when outrage at reports of his excesses mounted, an attempt was made to whitewash his sins by the official commission of inquiry, the Hunter Commission, which only found him guilty of grave error. It was only a thoroughly documented report was prepared by a team from the Indian National Congress that the British admitted to what had happened. Dyer was relieved of his command and censured by the House of Commons, but promptly exonerated by the House of Lords and allowed to retire on a handsome pension. Rudyard Kipling, winner of the Nobel Prize for Literature and the poetic voice of British imperialism, hailed him as the man who saved India. Even this did not strike his fellow Britons in India as adequate recompense for his glorious act of mass murder. They ran a public campaign for funds to honor his cruelty and collected the quite stupendous sum of 26,317 pounds, an astonishing sum those days and worth over £250,000 today. It was presented to him together with a jeweled sword of honor. So this basically, is an account of the Jallianwala Bagh massacre. And again, the question here is we see in 1919, where when presumably, we were living in a much civilized world, that this is happening. If this is not racism, what is? Finally, we come to 1943. India gained independence from the British in 1947. This is just before that. So there were 11 large-scale famines in India during the British period, and none since independence, by the way. So 30 to 35 million people died in the famines. About 3 million Bengalis died in the famine of 1943. Amartya Sen, actually his Nobel Prize is because of his work on famines. He argued that food availability in 1943 was 11% higher than in 1941, when there was nothing remotely like famine. Scientists at the Indian Institute of Technology at Gandhinagar in Gujarat in India have analyzed over 150 years of reconstructed soil moisture data, concluded that the famine was actually not caused by drought, but by British government policy failures. So what Sen says in this technical work is that the changing terms of trade between sectors of the economy due to the war economy during the Second World War, was to blame. And what he accuses is that the British imperial policy of confusion and callousness had this disastrous consequence. So again, the question is this criminal neglect? The famine killed 5% of the people of Bengal. So I worked this out actually, that given Britain's population in 1943, a similar level of mortality would have caused about 2.3 million deaths. Now, the thing is that would British policy have remained as casual if a food shortage caused that many deaths in Britain, even among the underprivileged classes in Britain? One would think not, right? I mean, this was possible because it happened, this criminal neglect, which is, again, the criminal neglect of the other, which is something we spoke about as one of the manifestations of racism. It happened because it was inferior. It was an inferior subject race whose lives were cheap, and they were actually, the victims of this famine. Well, I think I am kind of 1 minute over the time that I promised, so I'm going to stop now and take any questions that the audience might have.
Thank you so much, Rupayan. Fascinating stuff. I've just added a little note in the chat that I'm happy to read out any questions that you'd like to enter in there. We do have a good quarter of an hour still remaining to the booked time, so there's lots of time for discussion. While we're waiting for people to gather their thoughts and enter some questions in, I've been thinking about, the way that the study of race has really been taking on a new prominence in my own academic field, which is medieval studies. And there's really interesting work that's going on right now that's very much, I think you could characterize it as kind of rejecting some old hesitations that scholars had around painting with too broad a brush when it comes to racial questions. And a lot of that comes out of having, a tradition in which we really tried to specify historically what, a history of race that emerges really in the 17th and 18th century, and that is completely intertwined with experiences having to do with, colonization and economic exploitation, especially as far as slavery is concerned. Medievalists have been really trying to enable more discussions of race, and precisely by talking about the ways in which religious difference often functions in ways that are totally comparable. So there was a moment in your talk where you paused to acknowledge, some ambiguity around that. But I think we know from our own post 9/11 experience that, anti-Muslim sentiment in this country has not been particularly religious in its character, but has actually been a racism, like a newly invigorated racism emerged in anti-Muslim sentiment after 9/11. So I wonder if I could just ask you to think some more about that, because I think it's a really interesting question.
Oh, absolutely, Jason. I think that so there's this thing, this difference in religion, is somehow, at least, when we talk about the Goa Inquisition, right? I mean, there are accounts, which obviously I didn't have time to read, which was that the people who had converted to Christianity, the natives who had converted to Christianity were treated like second-class citizens, and even the priests, even those who attained the ranks of priests, were called black friars, and they are not accorded, the same respect or equality when you take, so that's a litmus test, isn't it? That you have taken away the religious divide, and when they, even after they have converted, they are not treated the same. They are investigated, okay, constantly investigated. Have they relapsed? And even if they have not relapsed, they're never accorded the powers and the privileges of they're debased, compared to the Portuguese themselves. So so obviously that provides a test of whether it's just religious or there are racial underpinnings as well.
Right, right. And there's a whole story there, of course, in medieval and early modern Spain that lasts all the way into the New World, right? I mean, there's New Mexico is a place where that kind of narrative is playing out, centuries after, the Inquisition was in Spain, et cetera. You ended your comment, thinking about another one of the kind of big important questions about thinking about racism is, what difference do other differences make? So we have a question in the chat from Brianna Carson asking what happened in this history that you're giving us to more prominent, recently termed essential people of the caste system, like doctors.
So what happened to doctors? Can you repeat the question, Jason?
I think if I understand the question, and Brianna's free to follow up in the chat while I try to parse it a little bit, but I think that the question might have something to do with, do class/caste differences change the degree to which Indians under colonial rule, get treated, right? Are there differences in how?
I was just wondering how they're treated, like if they were treated like also like poorly, if they're taken advantage of, like, because that is where policy would be like, important, and obviously they didn't probably follow rules of war. So I'm just wondering.
Right. Thank you, Brianna. One interesting thing is that, as far as the caste system is concerned, more perhaps than under the previous Muslim rule, what happened under the British rule, because of essentially, what Macaulay tried to do, so the access to what the British offered in terms of Western education was more accessible to the upper castes rather than the lower castes, right? So in fact, there is a hardening of the stratification of the class rather than breaking it down. This serves to so caste and class, let us say, kind of get stratified, and only after independence, through affirmative action, have successive Indian governments, at least, the governments for the first part of India's existence, who had socialist ideas, basically. The Constitution of India describes in India as a social democratic republic. So there was an attempt to break through this class-caste divide, which had kind of sort of become very highly correlated through affirmative action. And but what we know is that we know from race in the United States that it's a complex question, right? So even though governments might have a policy, even the people who come up with the policy might have contradictions, in their own behavior, right? And obviously it's hard to implement in such a large scale. But coming back to Brianna's question, I would think that, since, I don't know whether this answers it, but people of a certain caste, because they were able to get into, this favored strata, so to say, the favored strata who were the intermediary between the British and the millions of ruled subjects. Obviously their treatment would be better. And we have seen this in all forms of oppression, even the most horrific oppression in concentration camps, right? That there is a tendency to create a more favored class among the oppressed, and so and I think that has been a feature of oppression, through centuries. I don't know whether I quite answered your question, Brianna.
I think the point is so important, again, thinking about just the relevance of this to debates that are going on right now. I mean, the notion that policy has limitations when it comes to addressing the complexity of how racism works in systems is precisely the main question animating a whole theoretical field called critical race theory, which has been quite in the news lately. So there you have it, right? That like these questions don't, they are not settled necessarily by decision makers making decisions, even when their intentions are good. So our next question in the chat is from our colleague and friend Anjali Ram. It's a complex question. I think here again, I hear the question posed very much from the point of view of a present in which things are not looking amazing, especially in terms of the way that religion and nationalism can form a kind of unholy alliance, if you'll permit me to put it that way. Here's Anjali's question. One of the consequences of colonialism, as you discussed, was the denigration and devaluation of traditional and indigenous Indian knowledge systems, philosophies, literature, etc. And she referenced, this is the Macaulay Minute, famous example. In post-colonial, in post-colonial independent India, how far do you think we have come in terms of rooting out this colonization of our education and recovering our indigenous knowledge? And what can we do to recover, recuperate, and decolonize without giving in to narrow forms of nationalism?
So I think, Anjali and I would agree is that this is a very complex issue, and I wouldn't pretend to have the answer to this. And I think, what I feel is that if you think about the global economic system currently, so it has a way of rewarding the people in India who fall within this system, right? I mean, if you think of, let us say, the technology sector, let's say, Anjali, and here I speak as an economist, the first principle I talk about in my Econ 101 classes, that, well, people respond to incentives, and that's supposed to be the driving force behind, economic policy making, how the economy works, why people do what they do. If you ascribe to, the optimization model, so to say, in economics, and so I mean, the thing is, the way the reward system is now on a worldwide basis, I would think that the rewards are skewed towards modern education, if I may put it that way, for the lack of a better word, in India, and that's why we all know, the rush for parents to get their children into what we in India call convent schools, schools, formerly run by the missionaries and stuff like that, providing English medium education. And these days there are others. I mean, actually, since the time I have been in the United States, it seems that there are many international schools. So now the model being subscribed to is the international model, so to say, where all the kids have, obviously coming from a certain economic strata, all have laptops in classrooms and stuff like that. So it's very much skewed towards the prevalent reward system, global reward system, if I may call it that. So the problem is, of course, that and this is my personal opinion, that the conversation about recovering our indigenous knowledge, et cetera, earlier in the 80s, 90s, this was the conversation going on in leftist circles. This conversation has now been hijacked by the right in India, right? So it's very hard to actually talk about a path forward which returns these indigenous values into the Indian education system, where it has to be done within the confines of the worldwide, xenophobic, movement that has taken over in many countries all over the world, right? So that's a difficult conversation and a difficult answer. I mean, how to do that within what we're seeing is happening.
Thank you so much. We've arrived at the end of the hour. I'm so glad that we had such a rich discussion following such an interesting and relevant and rich talk. So let me just thank our speaker, Rupayan Gupta, again. Thank you, Dr. Gupta, and thank all of you who are able to join us. I realized that I should, at this point, announce that our next Hidden Truths talk is, looking at my colleague to see if she has it at the tip of her tongue. I think she doesn't now, but we have many more wonderful events planned for the rest of the year. So please be alert to the notifications in your inbox and make sure that you share those notifications with your friends and students, because this has been a great sustained conversations for many months already, and will continue into the future. So thanks so much.
Thank you, Jason and Laura, again for having me. And thank you everyone for attending the talk, and thank you for the wonderful questions. Have a good night, everyone.